Denora, thank you very much. On behalf of Philanthropy New York's board and members, of which I am one for another hour, thank you for doing this work and giving us a flavor of the exciting things that are happening in Action Civics. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Foster. In addition to being president and CEO of the Overbrook Foundation, I serve on Philanthropy New York's board and its annual meeting committee. I would like to reiterate what Jacqueline said at the beginning. We hope to hear from you during the reception later about all that you heard today. I'm here to introduce our first panel discussion. We have a spectacular set of leaders who have important insights on what it really takes to nurture and grow democracy today. The title of this segment of our program is Organizing is Everything: Race, Gender, and Cross-Movement Building. Coming at it from many different angles, these leaders are going to help us think about the practices in movement building that are working well and what the philanthropic sector can do to better support cross-movement building. I'm going to ask all the panelists to come and sit as I introduce them. So please come up now. And oh. I think so. Let me say this as we get started. Every one of these individuals have long and fascinating backgrounds to discuss. I recommend that you take the time to read their bios in the program. I will just give you their current affiliations and add a few words about the unique experiences they bring to this stage. First is our moderator, Sayu Bhojwani. Sayu is the founder and president of the New American Leaders Project, which works with people from African, Arab, Asian Pacific Islander, Latino, and Caribbean American communities to transform them into effective candidates and the inspiring candidates their communities need. Sayu was also New York City's first Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs. Next is Austin Belali. Austin is the director of the Youth Engagement Fund, the largest network of donors dedicated to increasing their participation among young people in the United States. Not only that, Austin knows a lot about organizing from his time as an organizer at the Service Employees International Union. Beside him is Kimberly Peeler-Allen. Kimberly is co-founder of Higher Heights, which is dedicated to expanding and supporting the Black women's leadership pipeline at all levels and strengthening civic participation. Higher Heights is building a national strategy to mobilize 1 million Black women and dollars by 2020. With a long background in political fundraising, Kimberly served as the finance director for Tish James' campaign to become New York City's public advocate. Next is Javier Valdes. Javier is co-executive director of Make the Road New York, which has quite possibly become the most recognized and effective organization in New York, building the power of immigrant and working class communities to achieve dignity and justice. An advocate on immigrant rights, affordable housing, and justice reform, Javier has also nurtured an immensely impressive youth organizing movement. We are very fortunate to have these extraordinarily knowledgeable leaders open our program. Sayu will lead us off, and we will have some time midway through for questions from the audience. Sayu, thank you for helping to get our conversation started.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I know I can't do this, but I really want to walk through and hug and say hello to my good friends who are in the audience who I think have been long been supportive of the movements that all of us up here are trying to build. And I won't name names, but some of you know who you are. So, but I think I would use up a lot of good, valuable discussion time if I did that. So I'm going to get right to it. We've already been introduced, and behind the stage we were talking about how we're in this moment where we have a kind of unified and common enemy, who I don't think I need to name, and how that gives us a certain opportunity to do the kind of cross-movement building work that we're going to be talking about, and what both the opportunities are in having a common enemy like that, and then what the dangers are when we are not unified in being critical of a particular entity, person who might be hurtful for one of our movements and not necessarily as hurtful for another one of our movements. So I'm looking forward to us exploring the idea of common enemy, opportunities, challenges within that. I think together we all here represent the intersection of everything that is under threat in today's political moment and frankly has been under threat for many generations. The rights of immigrants and people of color, the tension between the idea of a democracy and the reality of full participation by all in that democracy, and the undermining of youth and their ideas. But I think we'll end up having a discussion that's not as depressing as that might initially sound, because we're here to lift up the important work and ideas that are being pushed forward in our organizations and in our communities, because these are indeed the worst of times, but also the best of times. Because the resistance to policies and practices that are killing our young people, separating immigrant families, and depressing civic participation, that resistance is thriving. But how those of us who are leading this resistance are going to sustain ourselves, our organizations, and movements is a critical question for those of us up here as well as for philanthropy. I think cross-movement building and an intersectional approach are the only way to do so. And so I'm really happy that we're going to have an opportunity to kick off the conversation today around those issues. You've already heard our bios, so I'm just going to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves when they answer the first question, which sets the foundation for our discussion today. When we hear cross-movement building or intersectionality, I think each of us conjures up our own image of what that means to us or what we think that might mean to others. In short, I think of cross-movement building as the intentional linking of arms with others in struggle, and of intersectionality as an approach that understands the connective tissue between race, gender, class, and sexual orientation. But the floor really belongs to our panelists, so I'm going to ask them to answer what their definitions of cross-movement building are, and to specifically talk about how that differs from intersectionality, how it manifests itself in your work, and where you might see the tensions between cross-movement building, intersectionality, and identity politics. But I'm only going to give each of you 3 to 4 minutes to do that. So let's start with Javier.
Sure. So thank you, Sayu, and thank you all of you for having me here. My name is Javier Valdés. I'm the co-executive director of Make the Road New York. And I really appreciate the support that many of you have given us. We are an immigrant rights community-led organization. We have 5 community centers across New York State, 3 here in the city. You know, the way that I think about cross-movement work is a little bit about how I also think about how we run an institution such as Make the Road, because of the way that we respond to events or try to move campaigns forward. Just last week, I think everybody heard about the tragic incident of a transgender individual who was coming from Honduras. Her name was Roxana, a transgender woman that was killed at the border. We kind of been following this whole caravan that was coming up from Central America. We at Make the Road have a large transgender community that we help organize, provide space to, et cetera. And then we came out and really did a vigil for her and the young Guatemalan woman that was killed by a Border Patrol agent that Wednesday. And that's some of the ways that we think about cross-movement building is like, you cannot be pro-trans but not be pro-immigrant. You have to be able to demonstrate to be for both. So that's like one way that we try to demonstrate with our activities. It's a little bit in the work that we do, and it's in our DNA, but we sometimes don't spell it out just as much. Then there's other big opportunities that come about here in New York. A lot of, when this president came into power in January, one of the first things he did sign was an executive order banning Muslims. And we and many of the allies and organizations in this group and across the city, we all responded to that moment or that event. And our organization decided to play a leadership role with many others to make sure that an attack on one immigrant community is an attack on all, that if they were going after the Muslim community, we all had to stand together. So really defining issues such as that and really build solidarity. And then around the criminal justice system is something that we've been doing a lot of work with, in particular around police accountability. And I think that's where we really have to stand up and be with each other and for each other. The Right to Know Act and the Community Safety Act were two critical legislations that we were able to pass here in New York City. And the only way that we were able to help move that work was to really engage Black and brown communities in particular, but other communities to kind of have a show of strength that we were going to be stronger together. So those are like some of the opportunities. My organization is very diverse, even though a lot of people perceive this as a predominantly immigrant. It all depends where the community centers that we're in. And I think because of that, we can provide a leadership role in cross-movement building because we're doing it within our institution. And one of the things that we're challenging ourselves in this moment is to get a little bit out of our comfort zone and do that more at a larger scale and engage with many others that are doing this critical work as well. One of the things that inspires me is that folks want to do this. I feel like everybody's willing to put everything on the line, and particularly members that are immigrants themselves, that this might be the last time that they see their family, that they're willing to engage and be out there if there's a killing of a young Black man or if there's a transgender woman that has been attacked. They want to be there in solidarity with others, and I think we need to nurture that moment right now. And this needs to last, not just this presidency. We need to set the foundation for the long term. This cannot just be a 4-year run. This really has to be something that helps move this work for longer.
Can I just ask you to go a little bit deeper on that last point? Like, do you see the work that you're doing around cross movement and within your communities looking differently in this administration, or has there been an increasing awareness over time about the need for that cross movement work?
So I would say it's a little bit of combination of the two. I think it's been a little bit expedited around this administration. I think we've been more intentional about doing this work. In the immigrant rights movement in particular, like as I think about it, we want to be the generation in immigrant rights that not only wins immigration reform for the people that are currently here, but doesn't close the door for the people that are coming behind us. And I think that's like a critical thing for us, like for many generations. That has not been the case in the immigrant rights field. They're like, let's just take care of the people here, and then we'll figure out the rest. And I think that's, to me, it's a cross-movement moment. I've really been thinking about what does it mean for the future generations. So that's one way that I think we have changed our tactics, and has been reflected in the DACA fight. And I think one of the things that you probably saw there was a lot of young dreamers in particular, documented people, were saying, I'm not going to get a permanent path for me at the expense of my parents. And I think making those changes has been important.
Kimberly.
So thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, we all have many friends in this room. This is an amazing moment. As, like you said, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, but it is also a time where we can focus on the commonalities. So at Higher Heights, we really work with Black women across the board to talk through what are their challenges, what are their opportunities, what are their priorities, what are the things that keep them up at night, and link them to movements across the board, because whether it is the asthma rate for their child and the environment, or civil rights issues, criminal justice, all issues are Black women's issues, and being able to work with organizations, partners, or even just bringing awareness to that fact, because so often when you say you're working in the women's movement, it's very focused around reproductive rights, and that's just like one small piece of the broader narrative and the broader priorities, and economic stability, so that Black women and their families can't just survive but are actually thriving. What are the policies and organizations and partnerships that can come together to really elevate that and being able to work very deliberately in this moment where intersectionality and cross-movement building is not just a pleasure, but it's a necessity. We've been definitely exploring so many other partnerships that we had not previously had. We work with Sayu and the new leaders all the time, but being able to take that even further to working with environmental groups and being involved in coalitions and cohorts of organizations who are and brought together by philanthropy to say, we know that all of these things are interrelated, so how do we bring you all together so you can come up with the best solutions, and making sure that no one is left behind, because I think that is like you said, you don't want to close the door for the generation coming behind. How do we make sure that everyone in this moment is taken care of? And the only way we can really do that successfully is to be able to come together and have these conversations and come up with strategic plans. Higher Heights has had the privilege to be in 2 such cohorts funded by philanthropy to talk through the intersection and the cross-movement building between LGBT rights, women's rights, civil rights, and the environment, as well as looking at the full spectrum of women's issues, from their interest in politics to just wanting to be involved in the process of whether they are young women or older women, or thinking like 2 steps away from declaring a candidacy, being able to come together and really spend time to develop policies and practices and be able to really implement those for success has been a real gem of this moment. The challenge is, Higher Heights has been around for 7 years, and we had not previously been in these conversations, and really our focus had just been so myopic of our mission, but having the support of philanthropy to say, okay, let's give you the bandwidth so that we can really, not just go from problem to problem, but how can we try and build a pipeline and create a space so that we can actually not just put a Band-Aid on it, but actually do surgery and cure cancer.
Right. Work through that.
Austin.
Yeah, I think the short response I would give to cross-movement building, it's really redefining what it means to be a real American. Everybody who is of color in this country at some point has watched television or been told themselves that they are not a real American. And one of the biggest barriers to cross-movement building is a lack of a shared identity. One thing I learned from Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee through the work of the Youth Engagement Fund, we work very closely with them, is that every great movement in this country's history has tried to redefine what the we is, the pronoun we and we the people. And that each generation has its historic task to be expanding that we to include more and more people. And today, what that means is expanding the we so that we can actually build a cross-racial movement, a cross-gender movement. Fundamentally, for me, it means focusing on young people of color. And the reason why is that you don't really have to teach people to see their movements as interconnected if they never learn to see them disconnected in the first place. And we know that events that happen at the age of 18 are 3 times as powerful and influential in your life as the events that happen at the age of 40. So for all these reasons, when we look at a state like Colorado, for example, where 40% of the young people are of color, or Texas, where 2/3 are of color, or Georgia, Mississippi, that we've got to put a voter ballot in the hand of every young person of color in this country when they turn 18, and educating them with civic engagement to show that, no, they are real America, and asking them what is their vision for the future. So that's first. How do we increase, when it comes to cross-movement building, how do we increase the civic participation of young people of color? Number 2, a lot of the reason why there isn't a strong emphasis on cross-movement building is because we have sites of strong opposition in the South and the Southwest, where you have intentional efforts to try and restrict voter participation, where you have intentional efforts through preemption to stop local communities from passing laws at the local level that can benefit their communities. So people are learning that we are not American, we don't belong as part of the society, so they hunker down. So secondly is, I know that most of the funders in here are focused in New York, but a lot of this battle on cross-movement building is going to have to take place in the South and Southwest of the country. places like Georgia, Arizona, where the demographic shifts are being driven by young people of color. And then the third piece, and this comes to your question about intersectionality, is many of you are thinking about civic engagement, and we got to diversify there. But who are actually running the campaigns for voter education, registration, engagement? They don't look like the diverse communities that we claim we want to touch. So the third piece there is that intersectionality matters, is how do we build a deep bench of people who live at the intersections of multiple identities? So that when you run a campaign, you're not trying to cut and segment the electorate into bits and pieces, because in my identity, living at the intersections of identity, I recognize that a campaign has to be run in an inclusive way. And one way I've heard people say it is, there's no such thing as a single issue movement because people don't live single issue lives, right? So those three things, I think it's really about increasing civic participation among young people of color will get us closer. We've got to be focusing on places where there's the greatest amount of opposition to cross-movement building. And then third, building a pipeline of leaders who live at the intersections of identity. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, if you ask most young people if they were on a boat, what role would they want to play on that boat in a storm? Most of them would tell you, I want to be the captain of the boat.
Even in a storm.
Even in a storm, right.
I mean, I want to be the captain, but not in this storm.
Not in the storm.
Which
Well,
makes me not young, I guess.
You got to get ready because we're in one. But what if every young person of color in this country didn't want to be the captain, but they wanted to design the ship? And that's the fundamental paradigm shift that we in philanthropy have to have around civic engagement. It's moving from just training leaders as captains to leaders as designers, to rethink what should a constitution in the United States look like? What would I add to it? What should be the new rules of our democracy? And I believe fundamentally that cross-movement building must happen in that space where we come together across race, across gender, across geography, and reimagine what it means to be we the people.
Where is Michael? Is Michael here? Because I just want to show you that Austin did this. He took this to this place of civic engagement and electoral politics, which I am really on board with, so we can talk about that. But I didn't have anything to do with it. We did not practice. We did not say, Austin set me up to talk about New American Leaders, which does train people of all backgrounds to serve in politics as campaign managers and as leaders and as the redefiners of democracy as we know it. But thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about the intersection of our movements and electoral politics, because that is something that is new, I think new to 2016, post-2016. Like Higher Heights, New American Leaders has been around for 8 years, and it was like really pulling teeth getting funders to think about immigrants running for office, and there was a lot of, well, they don't really vote, we're not really interested in electoral politics, et cetera, et cetera. And then 2016 happened, and everyone was interested in electoral politics. So I wonder if you, maybe we start with you, Kimberly, if you could talk about, you touched a little bit on how the work has changed, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about how does it look differently in 2016 and what, post-2016, and where have there been, beyond what you already said, additional opportunities to bring in new voices and new actors as part of the intersectionality of your work. And I'll say, you know, for each of you, you're working with specific communities that that have become a flavor of the moment, if you will, right? Black women, immigrants, young people. And I don't say that lightly, because we have been doing this work for a very long time and will continue to do so. But right now, there's increased attention on the particular communities that we work with. And so I'll start with Kimberly, but you don't have to speak just about the population you serve. But from your vantage point, how do you see this post-2016 environment, particularly as it relates to electoral politics and civic engagement and cross-movement building?
So I'll start with this. We don't have a post-2016 moment. Our moment was post-Alabama. So Black women showed up 94% for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, and there was some conversation about the power of the Black women's vote, but it hadn't necessarily caught fire the same way so many of our sister organizations in the women's movement felt this huge influx of interest and support. When the Alabama special election happened, literally it was, you couldn't go anywhere without the hashtag Thank Black Women. And we said, well, finally, thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. We've been doing this since 1998. And we are grateful for the acknowledgement. But Black women have always shown up at the polls. They've been the huge backbone of the Democratic Party. We vote at higher rates than almost every other demographic group. And seeing, having those two bookends between the 2016 presidential election and then the Alabama special election really, I think, got people realizing if you don't have a Black woman or a Black women's organization or a Black woman partner in the work that you're doing, it is not going to be authentic. It is not going to get the results that you need, because at the end of the day, Black women are the ones who are showing up at the polls to advance progressive policies and politics. And because our lives are at stake. Like I said earlier, all issues are Black women's issues, and we know that what is at stake if we stay home, we are already at the bottom of just about every social indicator out there. So we have to do something. So being able to be in this moment where there is this new attention of, Black women are really doing something or have been doing something, we need to really support this pipeline and make sure that Black women are showing up at the polls in more in-depth ways, and Black women's policies are part of, and their concerns are part of the conversation as we are developing broader policies across the board, whether it is at the party level or in think tanks and looking at other research. But it has been a tremendous gift for this attention, because it's something that we've been working on for quite some time, but we are praying that it is not a flash in the pan, because Black women have been growing their electoral imprint, like I said, since 1998, and will continue to do so, and being able to support that so that they're not just at the polls, but there was an article that came out, I think, last week talking about the fact that Black women are such huge voters in American politics, but the policies that are being passed are not reflective of their concerns. And being able to then support elected officials and campaigns, organizing campaigns around the issues that are priorities for Black women, so that our vote actually translates into policy that will change for our communities. That is where we're really excited that we can hopefully really change what the discussion is around decision-making tables, as well as eventually changing the makeup of decision-making tables.
Can I ask you to briefly say, if we're in part of acknowledging the role of Black women in politics has demonstrated itself through people sort of wanting to reach out to your and other organizations, right? So could you speak to how do we do that in a way that is that doesn't essentialize, or that is not just giving lip service to, but that is really in partnership and in the spirit of cross-movement building? What is maybe an example of a way that you have partnered that you felt is a meaningful exchange or a meaningful relationship?
I think a great way that we've partnered with a couple of organizations is at concept inception of coming in and saying, we want to do this, but we want to make sure that we do it right. How do we make sure that we are being inclusive and not just having you as not just having you as a token, and being receptive to the critiques and and feedback to make sure that we are putting together some really strong, robust programs that are truly inclusive and deliberately intersectional, and being able to have those conversations, and I think making sure that it is, you can't call us at the 11th hour and say we need you to do X, Y, and Z, just because we need to make sure we get some black girls there. We get that we're in right now, and we love that. All that black girl magic y'all can enjoy, but making sure that it's a real exchange, and you're recognizing that we appreciate having the opportunity to bring our voice to the table, but all of our issue areas, all of our organizations, we are grossly under-resourced, where so many of our majority organizations are probably a little less under-resourced, because I don't think there can be enough money put to this work, but being able to make sure that in addition to the critique and the support and the engagement, there's also resources put behind it, because a lot of our organizations, we're very small, little but mighty, but there's so much more that needs to be done and can be done when we're properly resourced.
Austin, can you speak to this particular point too, of like how can we be strong long-term allies for young people in this moment and beyond? And I know you touched on some things, but would want to add anything more to that?
Well, I think two ways that come to mind. One of the biggest tensions when there's a wave of new activism is we essentialize young people.
Right.
And one of the things we say a lot is what's unique about young people isn't their youthfulness, it's their newness.
They're not tired like we are.
They may not as tired as some of you are. They come with new, not you, I mean,
No.
big you. Newness in terms of energy, newness in terms of perspective, newness in terms of questioning assumptions, newness in terms of asking things that nobody else wants to ask. Because when you essentialize young people, when you say another youth movement and you don't see it as a new movement, you lose the disconnection and why it matters for a broader social change. The other part of being new is that you don't have the wisdom, because you haven't been around to look at previous examples before you. So there's a polarity between harnessing the newness of young people in a movement moment like we're in post-Parkland, plus transmitting wisdom from past generations of struggle. And that tension, it takes a very careful and deliberate management of that tension, because most people will either say, young people have all the answers, leave them alone, or they say, young people have none of the answers, we'll make all the decisions.
Right.
And the truth is that it's somewhere in between, and you need tightrope walking. So what's the technology to break that down for funders in particular? It's really convening spaces. That if you look back at Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the Civil Rights Movement, they came out of the sit-in movement in the early 1960s, and it was an older person, Miss Ella Baker, who organized the convening at Shaw University in North Carolina and said, hey, all of you have been mobilizing and doing sit-ins, let's have a conversation about how you take it to the next level. They leave that meeting and say, let's go to Mississippi and register voters. So ideas like that emerge out of convening spaces, and a lot of funders lose, particularly in civic engagement, the importance of space and relationships for sparking the kind of intergenerational transmission of wisdom, while at the same time harnessing the new perspective and energy of Generation Z and millennials.
Yeah, that he was looking at me, but he really meant you guys.
Well, the lights are so bright, I can't see anybody out there, so I'm just
No, I'm just clarifying that I'm not the one convening. Javier, I assume that you had the same experience that I did after the 2016 elections, and particularly after the first ban, where people who were not otherwise engaged with the immigrant community were calling to say, what can I do? I'd love if you could speak a little bit about what you did with that, and then speaking more directly to the communities that you work with, how has this post-2016 moment, I mean, I think we all are very familiar with what it's done to our communities in terms of fear and anxiety, but if you could talk about the opportunities it's created for civic engagement and electoral politics in particular.
Sure. So we're very clear that this administration has declared war on our communities. It's unprecedented. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen what I've seen right now. That understanding that and living through that and what our members, their fear every day, it's real. The thing that inspires me the most is that folks that have the most to lose are the ones that are pushing us and says, we have to create a different United States where we belong and so on. So sometimes it's good to have an enemy and it's good to be against something, but our folks are pushing us to be for something. As it relates to this civic engagement, I think sometimes in our work, we've been the last one, the forgotten one, or the one that, like, at the very end, let's try to give resources. I know there's been a lot of work to try to change that over the time. But what we want to be able to do, we want to co-conspire with all of you. We want to be equal partners and really thinking through all the campaigns. We not only want to be brought in to think about Latino engagement, we want to be brought in to think about the whole campaign and what does it mean and how do we do things. Because I think we can bring a lot to the table. And I think by being co-conspirers and really being in that space with you all as equals, regardless of resources or regardless of the stature of our institution, it gives us an opportunity to give a lot more. And I think folks then are willing to even sacrifice even more for those issues or those campaigns. I think the other thing that I realize in all this is that we in the immigrant rights community, communities of color, is that we have to be unapologetic about our issues. For very, very too long, many people, primarily in the Democratic establishment, have always said, you know, we care about your vote. Please come out. Let's figure out a way to support you. I can't come out right now and say I'm for your issue, but don't worry, I got you when the legislation comes. That no longer works for us. It no longer works for us, and we're being very clear with anybody that wants the support from the immigrant community, the communities of color, has to be unequivocal in their support of the policy that we're pushing for. In New York, like for example, driver's license is a big issue, and people are talking about it a lot right now. You don't know how many legislators continue to say to us, yes, it's a good issue. I understand it, the deportation that can happen because of you driving without a license. I can't take that vote right now, but I got you once I'm in. And that never happens. That's actually not true. And I think what we're trying to do is in thinking through civic engagement is that we have to think about the issue work, because we have to create the groundswell and the ability to educate the public around the issue so that we can then increase civic engagement for not just communities of color, immigrant and Latino voters to come out and vote for driver's license, but for the general public to understand that this is a good policy that benefits all New Yorkers. So I think that's sometimes that we run things in silos, and I think connecting the two really matters. Co-conspiring really matters, and really thinking about the teams and like how do you. I like what Austin was saying about engagement. I feel like a lot of it has to be around issues of trust, and if we create opportunities for us to work together, fail together, really helps us really build that strong network that in those critical moments you can call upon somebody and work together. So those are some of the things I would say.
Okay. I want to open it up for questions, but I'm going to ask you all to comment on one quick thing. So we've actually, I think each of you have already said some things that funders can do, right? We talked about co-conspiring.
Yes.
You know, bringing us in at conception, convening, and then cross-pollinating across silos, right? So those are 4 C's for those of you who are alliterative.
Nice.
But we know that, you know, this is the classic, funders are some of my best friends, but they're also some of my biggest pains in the butt. And they do make life difficult for us when we're trying to work across. Like, I know at New American Leaders, for example, one of the great challenges we had is that people would say, well, you're not really immigration, you're not exactly civic engagement. And instead of what I thought was, oh, well, we could get civic engagement money and immigration money, it was like, oh, we don't know where to put you. So therefore, we're not going to respond to your emails for several weeks at a time. And then the real answer is going to be no. So I'm not bitter, though, because we're good. We're good. You know, what happened is we elected Trump, and now there's more money. But that is one of the issues, right? Like when you're not squarely in whatever department, program area has been created, then instead of it being an opportunity, it's more of a challenge. Can you very quickly go through any other challenges that you experience, particularly around cross-movement building work. I mean, let's not, they're our hosts, so we can't really just like tell them about all the issues that are problematic, just the ones that are referred cross-movement building. This is with love. It's good feedback for growth, which leads to, deeper satisfaction in your jobs and in your work, and better funding of our work. So challenges in getting cross-movement building funding. How do funders contribute to the challenge?
Can I throw out one just offhand? Is I think that C3 civic engagement funders are not bold enough. Mm-hmm. And there's a conflation of progressive with partisan. That's actually not true.
Right.
Javier just proved that actually there are some people in the quote-unquote Democratic Party who are not progressive on our issues, and there are some in the Republic who may be. So we conflate progressive and partisan in a way that prevents us from doing the kind of intersectional cross-movement building that's necessary to take bold stances on issues. And I can say on the other hand, donors who identify as conservative are playing huge in the C3 civic engagement space. And they're leveraging C3 nonpartisan resources to prevent any kind of change at the local level, to restrict voting rights, to rewrite the rules in redistricting. So that's the key thing I would put to C3 nonpartisan funders who have progressive values, is if you're asking for the folks on this stage and in communities across the country to be bigger and bolder than ever before, we need you to step up and be every bit as big and bold.
I think we could go home now, but
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure Kimberly and Javier have their piece.
I would absolutely echo all of that, and then also add in that this is not, none of us have seen a time like this ever in our nation's history. And the opportunity to try out, experimental work is, I think, vital to being able to capitalize on this moment so that we don't lose the last 50 years of progress, and being able to support that innovation without having proof of concept of like, okay, this is what we think is going to work and here's why we think it's going to work, but do we actually have data to back that up? Not necessarily, but I think trusting the organizations that are coming to you based on the innovation and the work that they have done in other areas, and being supportive of their work to try and expand or improve upon the lives of all Americans without 5 years of data that shows that this works, I think is critically important, because just in the last 6 months, everything that we thought was normal or should happen X, Y, and Z way is not. So clearly, doing things the same way is going to not just not get the results that we want, but is actually going to cause us to lose ground.
That's great.
Yep, I agree wholeheartedly on those points. And I guess the two main things that I would just say is that giving flexible resources, unrestricted funding to organizations such as ours on the ground, like when 2016 happened and the way that our community responded, we were able to do a lot of those things because we were able to tap into those unrestricted money that allowed us to best use our resources as we best see fit in that moment. And I think sometimes it's very hard for our institutions to kind of move with that level of flexibility unless we're able to get those resources. So really thinking about that in a real way, because sometimes the restrictions limit us in what we can do, and so being able to tap that. And then also being very flexible at how you measure success. I understand that we have to be accountable for the resources that you're investing in institutions like that, but the way that sometimes you measure success has to look at the whole picture. And sometimes we have to fail in order to learn and move and get these battle scars in order to be better the next time around. And I think sometimes that has impacted us being able to do that. And I wholeheartedly agree that sometimes it's just taking the leap of faith. If an organization that has a credible track record or is in the community that's doing the good work is saying to you, this is something that is critical at this moment, is really like trusting in them that they will use those resources in that way.
Great.
That's great.
A couple of things that I would add, and then get your questions ready, although I can barely see any of you, so we'll have to figure
Yes.
that out. You know, I think that on the issue of the proof of concept and taking the leap of faith, I think what we did see in the last couple of years or 18 months is and are seeing an incredible amount of energy. And you know, however we define wins, whether that's individual candidates or issues winning in 2018, I want to flag that, like, that's not necessarily because a bunch of us got together and planned a strategy, that actually it's responding to the moment, right? And this energy that's been created. And so there is also going to be a need at the end of this year to think about how do we sustain that energy through resources. And then, you know, I'll take a leap and say that another way of thinking about this is that when you all think about funding with your hearts, there is a lot of potential there. Instead of with your heads. I mean, there's a lot of time that foundations spend on thinking about strategy and, you know, planning strategy and having things on hold. And what I think happened after 2016 is that people responded with their hearts. They said, this is wrong, this is not okay, this is not the America that we want. You said that. And there were many of us who received support in non-traditional ways, right? Rapid response funds, et cetera. And that was a heart response. That was not an 18-month strategy that left us waiting, thinking about what was going to happen. And so if there's a way of doing more of that to give us the experimentation money, the innovation money, the big, bold money, and then the proof of concept, you know, I think that there's a lot of good that we could do faster and more effectively. So that there seem to be many closing comments here, but actually that was just a midpoint comment and a chance for you all to gather your question. So, oh, good.
Oh,
Yay!
Questions? How are we doing on time?
Maybe we take them in succession.
So
Okay.
can you?
Oh, there we go.
I'm sorry. Can you just a couple of quick things? So please introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Please say if you're asking your question of a specific panelist, and you know, let's try to keep it to a paragraph, not a page.
Right. Got it.
Take them in succession.
Doug Bauer with the Clark Foundation. Thank you all for being here. I want to go back to the bridge to electoral politics. Tomorrow will be 5 months to when we need to flip the House and hopefully flip the Senate. What are, you know, and I appreciate
You
all
mean
the,
that in a C3 way, right?
Absolutely. No, and you know, we all know that the boundaries are very bright, but they're very broad on what 501c3s can do. And Austin, you talked about the other side, the right, and how they're very creative and very bold in how they use 501c3s. I wonder if you specifically, and I welcome the other panelists to comment, when you talk about big and bold through your work and the other work that you see going on out there, how's that going to bridge to what we need to see happen 5 months from now?
Question.
Austin?
Well, I think we know what's at stake 5 months from now, and really, if money doesn't get out the door by the end of this month, particularly for young people, it's a little bit too late to have any kind of even issue, advocacy, and education impact. So the first thing I would say is the speed at which you can move resources in the next 30 days. That matters because young people are going to be coming back from their summer breaks. And we want to make sure that they come back and they'll get that first look at the syllabus, but they also get a voter registration card. That's the first thing. And then I think in the next 5 months to go bolder, I mean, there are clear efforts in the South and Southwest to try and make democracy harder for people of color. So the extent to right now you can be supporting organizations like in Georgia, New Georgia Project, organizations in Texas like JOLT, that have just come on the scene, and I could go on, who are using integrated voter engagement, where they're being bold about progressive issue stances, whether it be immigrant rights or reproductive choice, things that we stay away from, criminalization, and putting resources in the hands of those organizations. I think those two things, moving money early to IVE, the integrated voter engagement organizations, could make a big difference.
And just to underline that point, the examples you gave are local organizations. They're not national organizations that are parachuting in, which I think is an important distinction,
exactly
right? Other questions? Maria?
Hi. I wanted to just ask Javier if you would comment a little bit about what's been happening in Albany at the state level, since we're at Philanthropy New York. Both what some of the current challenges are in Albany and also where you see moments of opportunity. I know you mentioned one around driver's licenses.
Sure. Albany is probably the most complex, corrupt, malfunctioning space that I've ever operated in. So I'll just lead with that. I think, so it just, our state government is broken. It has been broken for quite some time. And it's really not representative of the people that are here in the state of New York. Just as an example, the primary example is who leads the Senate. In New York, the Democrats have the majority, but because of, for a very long time, or in particular the last 6 years, there was a group of Democrats that were with the Republicans, and that's how they were able to stay in power. Because the Republicans have been in power in the Senate, a lot of the issues that we care about have not been able to move forward. So issues such as driver's license or tuition assistance for undocumented immigrants, bail reform, more issues around police accountability, school-to-prison pipeline, all those get blocked. All of them are being stopped. And that's a huge issue and a problem for our community. One of the things that we're very concerned and why we think the fight is worth picking now is that what's going to happen in 2020. The reason that 2020 matters for many reasons, right? First is we have to get through the census, and we have to making sure that that particular question is not answered. But if there's no real change in the state Senate and there's people that are elected that are really representative of our issues, what happens after 2020 is redistricting. And for many, so I work in Long Island and in Brentwood, and you look, it's predominantly black and brown community there. And what happens is that Senate district gets literally split down the half, right? So they water down our votes and then water down our power. So that's a huge issue that's impacting us. So there's opportunities. We feel like elections are opportunities to elevate issues and to really have a different conversation and different narrative about what does it mean to be a New Yorker. We're doing that in New York right now. There's probably, you guys have heard, there's an interesting gubernatorial campaign happening that is allowing for those issue debates to happen, which I think is critical. Because we in communities of color in particular do not believe in coordinations. We think that people should actually fight and advocate for our votes and try to get our votes and not just think that they're taken for granted. And the best way to do that is sometimes to create some kind of challenge and for folks to really be saying, you know, I actually have to not only just show up to this community every 4 years, but I actually have to see and think about what policies would impact them and see the whole picture.
So I just want to add a couple of things to that are related to some systemic issues in Albany. So, you know, there's no term limits, right? Which is part of the problem that the reason that we can't get some of our folks in. The salaries are $78,000 or something like that.
It's considered part-time work.
Yep.
Yeah, for part-time work, but you know, who is the kind of person who can go up to Albany as a part-time job, or who can survive on $78,000 in New York City? There's an additional layer to how power is being concentrated in New York, in particularly in the city, in that if you're a city council member, you earn $145,000, and so folks are leaving the Assembly or the Senate and trying to run for city council seats. And so what you then have is this career politician. And there's some good things about having an experienced bench, but there are lots of issues that are created as a result of that. We don't get the turnover, and you know, some people believe that that term limits are kind of dictated by the voter, but obviously that's not really how it works. So you have these kind of lack of representation, this systemic issue. These are all things that I think funders need to be working on, that there's a direct service piece, there's a direct engagement piece, there's the advocacy piece, there's the systemic changes, and the kind of culture change that's required among the residents of a state when you're advocating for either higher salaries for state legislators or term limits, because people who barely can make their own ends meet are not necessarily going to want to see higher salaries for state legislators. But the argument for higher salaries is that you might be able to get someone who is working class, has a mortgage, college debt, et cetera, to be able to serve the people. Couple more questions? Yes.
Hi, so Lakeisha Hudson with Tide. So as you guys talk about sort of the organizing C3 projects, I'm wondering if any of you are simultaneously pushing C4 strategies. We're seeing lots of organizations that are starting C4s, but also C3 projects and having conversations with donors. So just curious about your experience and what are the conversations you're having with funders around C4 strategies to support, advocacy and policy change efforts.
I think we all have C4s, yes?
Yep.
So,
Yep, we all have C4s. So at Higher Heights, we have, we work on organizing and mobilizing Black women to harness their political power, as well as starting to groom them to take on leadership roles. And then through our C4, we then get into direct candidate engagement through a political endorsement process where we're able to match candidates and mobilize our voters around the issues that have come forward in the work of our C3 and see it all as interconnected to being able to move the needle. And we do research through the C3 that then informs the work of the C4, and then we also have a fairly connected PAC. So, and other things as well. But it is critically important to do the two together. We've actually done some projects that have been, we've had C4 funders who are very interested in C3 funders, so we are able to put together a project that is jointly funded in this space. We did that pretty successfully in 2016 around voter mobilization and our Black Women Vote campaign, and being able to have funders who are, who see the strategic importance of working both angles at the same time has really, I think, led to a lot of our success because we can't work one without the other, because there's just a complete fall off if you just mobilize, but then you don't actually have the issue and candidate work along with it.
Javier, do you want to speak? You have a C4. Right?
Yeah, we also have a C4 very similar to their structure. I think one of the hardest things for us is that there's C4 funding for communities of color is almost non-existent or is very small, and like trying to raise those resources is extremely hard. And then it puts us in a position that political money or C4 money, the people that get that is the DC Beltway consulting class that just parachute into states or parachute into localities, and they come in and they just spend millions and millions upon anything, and then we get a little bit of the leftover, and it's just not workable. And I think we have to change that structure, kind of hold those resources a little bit more accountable, invest more in local organizations that are really doing good work on the ground, and then making sure that there's again, we want to be co-conspirers, not be brought late into the game. And I think that's one of the biggest issues. But if we do harness both C4 funding and C3 funding, I think the level of systemic change for our communities and what we can deliver to our folks will be game-changing in many ways.
Do you want to add to?
Just on the timeline, because we have some experience with C4s as well. On the timeline, C3 money is helpful earlier. So the big push is if you're a C3 donor and you get your resources out as early as possible. C4 money can come in later on and can really help drive the issue. So there obviously can't be direct coordination between the two, but I do think a knowledge of the cycle of civic engagement is very helpful as you're making your funding decisions.
Any other questions? Yes, and then you, Mike. There's somebody in the back.
Thank you. Heather Nestle with New York Life. So thinking about how you work with corporate funders and corporate foundations, we do have hearts, but it's a little bit more difficult for us to fund through our hearts than our heads. So can you talk about some of your successful partnerships with corporate funders and how they tackle this? Are they doing single issue? Or are they able to support larger, cross-movement building?
So we've had really positive experiences with our corporate funders. I think for us, getting in the door has been really difficult, but Beyond that, I think we've been able to forge a couple of really strong partnerships. I think the challenge was similar to what I described earlier, that there's sort of community relations money, and then there's foundation money. On the community relations side, one of the challenges that I know we experience that may be different for each of you is that, you know, there's money for Asian American issues and money for Latino issues and et cetera. And so we were kind of caught a little bit in that, but managed to kind of navigate that process. And there are some individuals, I mean, corporations are, let me be careful about this because we know we have some opinions about Citizens United, but I mean, there are really fantastic people working in corporations who are very supportive of our work, and that's really been the entry point. But I know that that silo business within the community relations has been a challenge. So I don't know if any of you have.
Yeah, I would agree that that's been our biggest challenge, is we don't fit neatly in a particular box, and because we do have a C4, it has scared away some corporate funders. So we're in the process of developing some strong relationships with one or two corporate funders at the moment, but it has definitely been, traditional philanthropy, individual giving has definitely been a lot easier.
Yeah, go
Just
ahead.
really quickly, a big opportunity for corporate philanthropy to think about is they came out with a list of the skills that you need for the 21st century economy. And most of those skills are not happening in K through 12 education. They are happening in civic engagement, social and emotional learning, leadership development. So I know that JP Morgan has a philanthropic arm that's been focused on the future of work. And we're actually funding Wellstone Actions data boot camps, where they're training young people who otherwise would not be able to go to college or community college in hard data skills so that they can run civic engagement campaigns. But in that process, they're learning skills that are going to make them viable for the future of work. So I think there are ways in which we can think about civic engagement in a broader way than just about power building. That also includes some of the other initiatives that might be happening at your institution.
And the other thing I would add is that it would be helpful, you guys tell me what you think, but I think it's been a learning process for us to understand what that individual needs to get from us to be able to navigate the process internally. And we don't always know that. And I think we've really benefited from having champions who are helping us understand what they need in order to be able to get a grant to us. So that's just another place to, what, as Javier has been saying, like if you see us as partners in making this work possible. Did you want to add anything about the corporate?
I just feel like one example of how, in the civic engagement context, a lot of corporations have been super helpful in resourcing the process to become a new American, right, to the citizenship process. And I think that's very critical and has been super important in our communities, because as you get a person that just became a U.S. citizen to vote in their first election, all the studies have showed that you get them for long-term engagement in their work. And I think that's one way to think about it, where you are not doing civic engagement per se in like voter turnout, but citizenship is one of the most critical ways that you all can resource the work.
Mike, did you have a question still?
You mentioned briefly collaboration, contact, work with the environmental movement, particularly on climate issues. I wonder whether you'd elaborate a little bit on your experiences, good things, bad things, efforts that perhaps funders can help to improve.
Well, I think for us, it has been, it's a burgeoning conversation. And I think the opportunity just to even be together and say, oh, wait, you're doing this and I'm doing this, and there's a huge overlay, has been tremendous. And we're in the process of fleshing out what that means and how we move forward. But I think it's also being able to provide a space for us as organizations to carry each other's water and be able to speak to our populations or our focus groups about broader issues than what is kind of in our original mission. And that, I think, has broadened the work and has broadened the engagement of the people we come in contact with. So I was specifically speaking about, I'm a Roddenberry Fellow. The Roddenberry Foundation has their inaugural cohort, and for the 20 of us, 20 fellows to come together who are at the intersection of race, gender, LGBT rights, and environmental rights, and be paired up for a week to talk through what it is to be in this movement, in this space, was really mind-blowing for all of us, because we've all been very, very siloed. You know, some cross-pollination between women's issues and civil rights, but to be able to have that opportunity to really explore and have the support of the foundation to say, okay, whatever you guys want to come up with in addition to your projects for the fellowship, you know, we're interested in exploring, you know, how we can be supportive, which has prompted a lot of conversations and conference calls about ways that, you know, in addition, you know, nobody necessarily has the bandwidth to really flesh it out, but being able to just say, okay, let's start this conversation where we never would have come together otherwise. And I think that has been really a very enriching experience for all of us to be able to have those kinds of conversations.
And I think there's a willingness for us to be elastic around learning and innovation that doesn't necessarily venture into mission drift, right? I think that there's clear, I mean, when I started New American Leaders, I started it because I was concerned about the fact that immigrant rights issues were not getting addressed at the congressional or at the state level. But in fact, over time, it's become clear that all these things that we've talked about, that having immigrant and refugees making policy brings this cross-movement and intersectional approach, and that they're going to be champions of progressive policies. But that was a learning process. And whether it's environment or energy or education, they're bringing their own perspective, their whole self to it, not just a single issue. But I think there is a learning process that many of us have to go through. So we have to close, but I have a fun question to end in the 3 minutes that we have. Each of you get a minute or so. It's the end of 2018. We've done all the C3 good things that we wanted to see happen, or several of them at least, and you have $1 million and you cannot spend it on your organization. How would you suggest that it gets allocated? And for those of you who are thinking $1 million is a lot of money, it is not. I understand that. But let's start with $1 million. You have $1 million to invest in cross-movement building work. How would you do it?
Do you want to go first?
Just jump in.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think I would start back from 3 impacts. First impact, I would be closing the voter engagement gap between young people of color and low-income young people and more affluent young people. And we can do that by resourcing youth-focused integrated voter engagement programs across the country, particularly in the South and Southwest. 2, I would be focused on scaling the voter engagement capacity of racial and gender justice organizations, who often are not seen as viable voter engagement organizations by traditional civic engagement funders. And if they were just given some resources to experiment and some back-end technical assistance to do the data collection, at the end of 2018, you can move them from here on the yardstick maybe a little higher. And then the third, I would be focusing on investing in data analytics and campaign training for young people of color, young women, folks that can be positioned starting this year so that in 2020 they're running the campaigns and the organizations and driving the voter engagement programs in the future.
So I just want to be clear that that's at least a $5 million plan in case one of you is like, oh, I'm going to give Austin $1 million and he's going to change.
I have a plan to do that for $1 million.
Okay, there you go. I apologize.
But I'll take $5 million as well. No, I'm just kidding. That's a joke.
Are people getting paid with this $1 million, or is just the work that's going to? Kimberly.
I would take $1 million and have more deliberate convenings across issue areas with support for the leaders of the organizations, and to make sure that the cross-pollination and exchange of ideas and strategies and tactics are done in a very deliberate way, so that the engagement moves forward and is lasting beyond, where the next focus is automatically 2020 with all that is at stake there. But how do we create these coalitions and these partnerships and these true collaborations so that it is 2030, 2040, and we're talking about long-term strategic planning that is truly intersectional and cross-movement, not just building, but sustaining.
So what I would first do is $1 million, just try to leverage even more money and come to you guys. I feel like because it is a short amount, it is a small amount of money, right? Like it sounds big, but in the world that we live in and the needs, it is a small. So like first try to see if we can leverage more and more investment. I think to me, the best ways to think about it is like who is doing the most important work in key geographies if we're looking from a national perspective that we need to invest in and help transcend. And what are some of the issues that are really going to help move that work? So let's say I'm pretty sure that in November we're going to have a new governor in Georgia. So they're going to enter the legislature in January. What are some of the issues that really impact communities of color, particularly black women in Georgia, that we can run issue campaigns that will then create systemic change? Because one thing that we know about legislators and legislation is that they like to copy each other. There's been the example in New York, we passed the municipal ID program here, and then many other municipalities did that. It happens all the time. So if we look at key geographies, and we invest real resources and not just think about it through civic engagement, but also think through issue work, you can really help transform our societies. And I think Georgia is because of great work there, there's going to be an amazing opportunity there. And then if very local New York, we'll probably be in a different position, but like hopefully the issues will get elevated once again. And I just don't want people to lose sight of that part of it in the equation.
So I'm going to use my moderator's privilege and suggest another idea as well, which is that many of us are going to be looking at 2020 for sure, but it's 2022 that we're really going to see the recomposition of state legislatures. So my sort of dream for $1 million would be to convene the right players after the 2018 elections to figure out what needs to be done in order to set state legislators up to redraw the map for America, right? So that we're able to engage young people, that we're able to respond to the policy needs of our diverse country, but that we need to start that work. We really should have started that work last year, but if we can start it at the end of 2018, get the right people in place, draw the right maps, and open up the opportunities for people of color and young people to really become the people that are in power and that are determining policy. So that's kind of my dream, in case anybody has a check. Thank you all. This has been a great conversation. I look forward to...
Before you guys jump off, I do want to thank you on behalf of everyone here. That was an incredibly rich and interesting conversation to start us off today. And you all were incredibly generous to give us your time to be here. So thank you for that, in addition to the work that you do each and every day.